Penguin Random House Audio presents Ruth, a Novel, by Kate Riley, read for you by Rebecca Lowman. A small potato in the blight still strives toward the light. Bill Callahan, Day. Gracefield. She was named Ruth before anyone could intervene. 2 days before Easter, 1963, rising from his plate of Hamburg pie, her father asked the Brotherhood convened at Gracefield to welcome Ruth Della Shawl. Without hesitation, they did. Later that night, Esther Shawl told her husband he'd chosen the ugliest biblical name she knew. It reminded her of nothing so much as a tuber. "I would have called you Maybelline Raisinette," she told Ruth, one of her many benign conspiracies. Esther, illiterate until 17, hoarded words and deployed the best only in times of great suffering or boredom. Ruth cherished those two especially, but found neither in the dictionary when she was old enough to use it. Maybelline was likely a word to describe long hair. Here a fantasied stallion tossed its head, and Raisinette, an extinct form of credenza. This analysis she reported with solemn confidence to Dorothy Mueller, whose own enviable name meant gift from God. God, Jesus, her mother, all of her dead relatives in heaven. Ruth knew that each could read her mind, and knowing this only provoked her inner imp. It scampered down to hell and returned with sacks of obscenity. Her parents dying, the private parts of cavemen and Egyptians in the children's encyclopedia, the words shit and sex. She hoped that those with access to her thoughts tuned in only occasionally, if alerted, and in that hope she was in ardent imitation of a child whose soul required no monitor. Growing up, Ruth surmised, was the process by which one became opaque to God, and this was why nobody could read her mother's mind, or the elders. Ruth thought of egg whites clouding in a frying pan and wondered whether she would still have evil thoughts when no one else could see them. There was only one document of her mother's early life in the Western colonies. It was displayed below the photograph of Esther's wedding day and above her brother Jeremiah's careful and menacing watercolor of the Virgin Mary clutching the baby Jesus. All 3 pictures hung behind her father's head on the wall that Ruth faced at the breakfast table. By closing one eye, she could see through him to the black and white portrait of 7 grim Detweilers posed beside a ditch, 1948. The men looked like Abraham Lincoln. The women, even her mother, like rats in kerchiefs. Ruth had memorized the chevron and invoked them under her breath every morning before grace. Samuel, Paul, Simon, Elsa, Esther, Sharon, Rachel. Her mother was 13 years old in the photograph and 17 when she fled east. The other 6 remained in black and white in South Dakota. Ruth knew that chanting their names would, by the power of prayer, make them aware of her, and she was inconsolable when her father became annoyed with her muttering and made her switch seats with James. Ruth's grandparents were not in the photograph, and her mother would say only that they were named Olfetter and Ankala and came from the Western colonies. Ruth imagined them sleeping under a rose petal in a walnut shell and leaping over candles. She told Dorothy Mueller, who at age 5 believed everything she was told, that she was related to Rumpelstiltskin. The Shawls lived in Gracefield, on the first knuckle of the index finger in the glove of Michigan, the most southerly of the Brotherhood's 3 North American dwarfs. Ruth recognized Gracefield as a complete ecosystem. It had forests, a lake, a library, a set of triplets, and her family. She, Jeremiah, and James often spent Sunday afternoon unsupervised in the woods behind the laundry. Once, while her brothers were occupied pulverizing an especially brown rock, she went down to a pond where she had once seen a salamander, and so now visited ritualistically. In a patient squat, she stabbed the mud with a stick. She was squinting to align two branches in the sunlight when something flickered in her peripheral vision. It was a red eft, and she covered it with one cupped hand just as Jeremiah and James crested the hill, come to daub her with rock paint. The eft had the moist, crepey texture of an old person's hand and glowed a toxic poppy. Ruth hid it under a damp handkerchief under an inverted canning jar while humming Greensleeves, a song known to pacify lower creatures. When the eft's soft outline stopped twitching beneath the handkerchief, she prayed for it to stay alive and was relieved but not surprised by God's compliance. Then Ruth had an idea, so abrupt and precise that it had to be holy orders. She would send Ulfetter and Ankala a present. Her father found her an hour later behind the stables, sobbing and unable to explain why she had put a live eft into a bottle of dishwashing liquid. He was, as always, bewildered by her tears, immune to emotionalism but still powerless before it. So while she cried, he made an engineering project of extracting the softening carcass, which he then left in 3 pieces by the sink. The shawls had absorbed the trauma by supper time, and Ruth was left to reflect privately and with deepening shame on her message from the angels. Further confusing Ruth was a second mythical pair of ancestors, Opa and Oma. Unlike her mother's parents, Opa and Oma were public knowledge. They led the community as a couple and were invoked in brotherhood decisions, their health and guidance daily prayed for. If God protected them as often as he was asked to, Ruth's ambivalence couldn't do them any harm. She imagined them as anthropomorphized knife and spoon. She deduced that they lived overseas, perhaps in Europe or Germany, and that they shared responsibility for the brotherhood with God himself. From beneath their purview, Ruth had no reason to fear Opa and Oma, so she didn't. Later, she would need to pass through them to get to God, but as they were commanded, they let the little children come and go freely. Ruth's mother spoke to her in Hooterish at home, and consequently Ruth never learned whether the language had application beyond scolding. The soft colony pidgin was full of words for dumplings, mucus, and foolishness. She knew that Hooterish was not written, and assumed this to be a failure of the alphabet. Decades later, on the internet, her queries would return phonemes so exotic that they appeared as empty rectangles on the screen. Esther often accused Ruth of buddling, a singular sin from the Western colonies. To buddle was to waste time on little jobs, to fuss, to fiddle, to sit in a corner skinning twigs with the edge of a spoon instead of tidying up. Buddling connoted no mischief, only diversion. As with lactation, boys would not or could not buddle. Ruth had no interest in human babies, and remembered little of her baby sister's realization. She imagined only a mother-shaped balloon, slowly inflating with pudding and marrow. Sue Ellen was an early coda to what should have been a larger family, greedily sealing Esther's womb against further children. Esther stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks after the birth. No one had yet been sent to help the family, so their father made do, serving drop biscuits every morning and butter sandwiches or plain hamburger for lunch. Ruth remembered him trying to fry a cucumber one family supper. She'd understood even then that he was deeply, magnetically pathetic. Should children pray? Arrayed in concentric circles in the meeting hall, the Brotherhood argued this point, diverging on whether prayer killed or quickened reverence. Rote prayer forced sentiment that should never be forced, said Edmund Dampf. Tobias Schmidt concurred. Prayer created a barrier between children and God. Johann Brown questioned whether grace could be freely chosen.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?